Memoria is a friend of ours. On the Discourse of Color One, Victor Villanueva, A Memory, Seattle, 1979. She is a contradiction in stereotypes, not to be pegged. He likes her right off. She wants to go to Beltune, the Denny regrade, to take photos. He wants to go along. He does, feeling insecure and full of bravado. Slipping into the walk of bravado he had perfected as a child in Brooklyn. Stops into a small cafe at the outskirts of downtown, at the entry to the regrade. It's a French-style cafe, the boulangerie, or some such. To impress her, he speaks French.
Dans ce cas, s'il vous plaît, et croissant pour les deux.
Don't laugh. It's how he said it. He's an English major, a senior, quite proud of having gotten this far in college. But he's insecure about what this will lead to, since he had only gotten as far as deciding to stay in college till he's finally in over his head. He tells her of a novel he will write someday. His description goes something like, I've been thinking about a novel about a white Puerto Rican kid who buys into the assimilation myth, hook, line, and sinker. He does all the right things, learns the language, learns how to pronounce R's in words like mother and water, and how not to trill the R when he says three, and he does well in school. He's even a war hero, does it all, only to realize that assimilation just can't happen. Yet he can't really be Puerto Rican. So maybe he goes to Puerto Rico to find out who he might have been and what he is tied to. I don't have it all worked out. The plotline might not have been worked out, but this was the impulse nevertheless to keep alive the memory of assimilation denied. A truism turned to myth, to try to hold on to, maybe even to regain, that which had been lost on the road to assimilation, a reminiscence. That morning I had spoken with Ceci, my friend, the Cuban English professor. Her husband had said something to me over the phone that I had to unravel quickly. Immediate translation from my first language to my only language, slipping the Spanish into English to understand. Their baby, I'm told, used to translate into Spanish for her mother when someone spoke in English at home. Translated the English into Spanish so that the English professor would understand. Cute. During that phone conversation, it tried to come up with a familiar Spanish saying about how Cubans and Puerto Ricans are two wings of the same bird. It was there at the tip of the mind, but I could never. I said it in English. Cece said it for me in Spanish, quickly, then again more slowly. I heard it. I understood it. I recognized it. I still feel unsure that I could produce it. My Spanish is limited to single sentences, never extended stretches of discourse. I can't. At least I don't believe I can. And I listen to salsa and mambo and bomba and Planeath music of my childhood, but I can't dance to it in front of anyone. And phrases from the CDs slip by me, untranslated. I am assimilated. I am not. So I was driving home from some chore or other on the afternoon of the morning I had spoken to Cece. And in the midst of a left turn, I thought, I'm 50 now, maybe a third of my life left. I wonder if I'll die without ever being fluent in the language that first met my ears. English is the only language I know, really, yet Spanish is the language of my ear, of my soul, and I try to pass it on to my children, but I'm inadequate. In some sense, the impulse of the book I had described 21 years ago gets worked out in bootstraps. The assimilation myth explicit in the title. The story told then elaborated upon with research and with theory. It's an attempt to play out a kind of Freudian pedagogy. The political explored through the experiential, and it does more. It's an autobiography with political, theoretical, pedagogical considerations. The story includes ethnographic research. The story includes things tried in classrooms. The story includes speculations on the differences between immigrants and minorities, the class system and language, orality and literacy, cultural and critical literacy, Freire, ideology, hegemony, how racism continues, and the ways in which racism is allowed to continue despite the profession's best efforts. And in so doing, the story suggests how we are all of U.S. subject to the systemic. This is the personal made public and the public personalized, not for self-glory nor to point fingers, but to suggest how, maybe, to make the exception the rule. Fix the, I wrote that in 1992. Now, some part of that first impulse reasserts itself, fictionalizing, telling the story, reaching back to the heritage that is at risk of passing away quickly, to the kids before my father died last spring. Remember to call your grandpa abuelo. He'll like the sound of that, since none of my sister's kids have called him that. If you let him, I'd just watch baseball day and night and not say much. Push him for the stories of Puerto Rico during his childhood. Ask him about catching shrimp with his hands. and the stories of how the neighborhood boys got a model of Ford, about the revolutionary who hid out in El Yunque, about his time in the army. Ask about Mai. Memoria is a friend of ours, 11, grandfather, a CEO, and gardening, and working as a groundskeeper and gardener for the university. And ask about Tio Benito, the tall farmer, inland on the coffee hills. Inland is important about knowing about being Puerto Rican, about Puerto Rico. I remember when I met him, a tall PR. Man, that was very cool. And he gave me sugar cane from his farm and a coffee bean and a lemon that he had cut a hole on the top of, and he told me to chew on the bin, squeeze lemon juice on the tongue, and chew on the cane. I wish I could give you that memory, Mellitas. Now, Mom is easier. She loves to talk, but she'd rather forget the past, and I don't want the past forgotten. So press her too.
A poem, Víctor Villanueva y Hernández. Triste lucha, la del árbol con espinas fuerte ardor, que solo su alma se cobija. Vano un pecio para el ser que vive, en tratar de comprender su propia vida. Muy dulce es percibir de la noche sus caricios, pero es terrible saber que más tarde, en la madrugada, agonizando todos ellos, quedan triste lucha del árbol con espinas, triste lucha la del que ya un poquito tarde, ni siquiera es más leve. Suspiro, su alma alienta. Triste, interminable lucha esta que jamás se aleja. Oh, qué triste lucha esta que a mi pecho tanto pena. Well, qué triste lucha. Oh, qué triste lucha en el pasado versa tu presente. 19 de enero, 1951.
Sad struggle of the tree of thorns, fierce feeling covered solely by your soul. Vain striving for he who lives, and trying to understand his own life. So sweet to see your caresses in the night, but so terrible to know that later, in the light of day, all the agonies remain. Sad struggle of the tree of thorns, sad struggle of that which is already a little late, without even the lightest sigh or soul's breath. Sad and interminable struggle, that which will never leave. Oh, how sad this struggle weighing so on my chest. Sad struggle, sad struggle. In the past turns the present, January 19th, 1951. The fiction, the bootstraps retold and fictionalized, would have to begin back then, not quite a generation after the change of hands. When the Spanish colony was handed over to the United States, the changes seen by 3 generations Boricua to New Yorkan to the middle class of color, far removed from the cultural soil of either of the generations, maybe even a wheat field in eastern Washington. It's important, the memory. So many have said this so well that it's hard for me to reiterate without breaking into the academic discourse of cite and quote Adele, Jan Mohammed and Lloyd, San Juan, Singh, Scarrett, and Hogan, Smorkaloff, and the standards like Anzaldúa or Huxall have written about the connections between narratives by people of color and the need to reclaim a memory. Memory of an identity in formation and constant reformation, the need to reclaim a memory of an identity as formed through the generations. And I'd say the need to reclaim and retain the memory of the imperial lords, those who have forcibly changed the identities of people of color through colonization. Nellie, the department's graduate secretary, hands me a flyer for a meeting of the Pacific Islanders group, inviting me to join the students, staff, and faculty, which includes 2 department chairs I work with often. We smile at each other. Her cultural ways, Filipina and mine, are so different, really, except that we have 2 out of 3 imperial lords in common, Spain and the United States. It binds us. Our first imperial lord was there before the world got large, more local. The Japanese and the Caribs, we laugh, while others look and listen on with looks of wondering. It's not their memory. Memory simply cannot be adequately portrayed in the conventional discourse of the academy. I am grateful for the acknowledgement of perceptions that academic discourse provides, for the resources the conventions of citation make available, for the idiocentric discourse that displays inductive or deductive lines of reasoning, a way to trace a writer's logical connections. Academic discourse is cognitively powerful, but the cognitive alone is insufficient. It can be strong for logos. It can be strong for ethos, but it is very weak in pathos. Academic discourse tries, after all, to reach the Aristotelian ideal of being completely logocentric, though it cannot be freed of the ethical appeal to authority. A demonstration, Agustin Lau, in Islands at the Crossroads. Puerto Ricanness traveling between the translocal nation and the global city, writes that. Puerto Ricans, like other racialized diasporas, function within multiple ambiguous registers of race and racism. As colonized subjects, all Puerto Ricans are colored by colonial discourses. On the other hand, differential processes of racialization can either nominalize Puerto Ricans as ethnic and/or allow some light-skinned Puerto Ricans to pass as white. A single Puerto Rican transmigrant can be classified as Chicana on the island, Black in Ohio, and Latina in New York, 178 minus 79. Now consider the rhetorical effect of Professor Lau's assertion, though with qualification, and a couple of stories from this light-skinned Puerto Rican both take place during the summer of 2000s. He was picked up at the registration desk of the hotel in Iowa City. The limousine, really a van, driver walks up. A man in his late 50s or early 60s, buzz cut, thick build, surely one. More accustomed to hard physical labor, a farmer, one would imagine, given the locale, says, at least the guest is on time, kind of to the person behind the registration desk, kind of to himself, maybe even to the guest. He goes on to say that the last guest he picked up had been 15 minutes late, then didn't pay the fare. Once in the van, the story of the deadbeat develops. It was a family of 4, including an infant. No car seat. I could have had my license pulled with no car seat for the baby. Then he tries to pay me with a $100 traveler's check. Like I carry that kind of money at 5 in the morning. Were they foreigners? Assuming the passengers would have overestimated the fluidity of travelers' checks. Who can know these days? The guy wore a turban. What are you? Internal soliloquy? He didn't say raghead, so maybe this is more the condition of the international seaports flowing into the middle of America, the in-migration of the newest immigrants and those new immigrants from the 1930s, a land no longer completely owned by those of Scandinavian and German ancestry. But 1898 and 1917 really should mean something in a situation like this. NB 1898, the U.S. acquisition of Puerto Rico. 1917, U.S. citizenship conferred on all Puerto Ricans. Me? I'm American. Kujda fooled me. Yeah, well, I'm from New York. The conversation ends. The next passenger turns out to be a black man with a crutch coming out of an upper middle class home in the suburbs of Iowa City. Kind of felt sorry for the driver and his comfortable assumptions. Second story, it was another one of those receptions produced by the dean of the graduate school. This one was to welcome doctoral fellows in residence. Most were persons of color. I was there as a department chair and as one of the mentors to a couple of the fellows. The scene, back porch of the house, clusters of folks with drinks in hand or paper plates with guacamole and chips, talking, smiling, overlooking cows grazing in the valley below, and green soft rolling hills nearby, maybe 300 yards away, where there will soon be wheat blowing beautifully in the wind. A conversation ensues with one of the fellows, a woman who grew up in the black area of Boston, Roxbury. Listening in is an associate dean, originally from Central Asia, overtly happy to be away from Russian bureaucracy. The conversation turns to race in the wheat end. VV, around here folks don't know if I'm Spanish, Jewish, Italian, from the Middle East, or from South Asia. Associate Dean, I would have thought you were Italian. Roxbury, I don't know. He looks pretty Puerto Rican to me. Sure, she knows the hue, she sees the nigger lips. One of those names I endured as a child. Just like Martin Espada, Nigger Lips was the high school name for me, so called by Douglas the car mechanic with green tattoos on each forearm and the choir of round pink faces that grinned deliciously from the back row of classrooms, droned over by teachers checking attendance too slowly. Douglas would brag about cruising his car near sidewalks of black children to point an unloaded gun to scare niggers like crows off a tree, he'd say. My great-grandfather Luis was un negrito too, a shoemaker in the coffee hills of Puerto Rico, 1900s. The family called him a secret and kept no photograph. My father remembers the childhood white powder that failed to bleach his stubborn copper skin. And the family says he is still a fly in milk. So Nigger Lips has the mouth of his great-grandfather. The song he must have sung as he pounded the leather and nails, the heat that courses through copper, the stubbornness of a fly in milk. And all you have, Doug, is that unloaded gun. Professor Lau, I would contend, is not quite right. Those of us who are light-skinned don't pass for white. We're just not automatically sorted into the appropriate slot. But more to the point is that Lau's academic discourse, complete with scare quotes and nominalizations, is insufficient, lacks emotional appeal. And though Aristotle thought it not right to sway with emotional appeals, he knew that the greatest impact on listeners is, in fact, the emotional. The personal here does not negate the need for the academic. It complements, provides an essential element in the rhetorical triangle, an essential element in the intellect, cognition, and effect. The personal done well is sensorial and intellectual, complete, knowledge known throughout mind and body, even if vicariously. And for the person of color, it does more. The narrative of the person of color validates. It resonates. It awakens, particularly for those of us who are in institutions where our numbers are few. We know that though we really are Gramsci's exceptions, those who through chance have had opportunities that the 1,000 others in reality could not or did not have, but are always analogous to other experiences from among those exceptions. So more than narrating the life of one of color, so that one creates this possibility, suggests the process, indicates the opening, in Gramsci's terms, selections from Cultural Writings 132. We remember the results of our having realized the possibility, discovered the process, found the opening, while finding that there is, in some sense, very little change on the other side. This is what Ellis Coase describes as the rage of a privileged class. This is Luis Rodriguez's call that we'll read below. Ellis Coase, I've written before on colonies, explains, mainly by way of anecdote, the reasons African Americans in particular continue to be angry even after having crossed over to the other side. He explains the ways in which little slights continue to display the racism inherent in our society. Those dozen demons are 1. Inability to fit in. 2. Exclusion from the club. 3. Low expectations. 4. Shattered hopes. 5. Faint praise. 6. Presumption of failure. 7. Coping fatigue. 8. Pigeonholing. 9. Identity troubles. 10. Self-censorship and silence. 11. Mendacity. 12. Guilt by association. 57 minus 68. I haven't been called a spick in many years, except by others of color, perhaps in fun, I hope. Yet little things happen that betray the underlying racism that affects us all. No matter how appalled by racism we might be, I read Anzaldúa or Hooks or the poetry of Espada or Cruz or Esteves or any other writing of color. And I know I haven't become clinically paranoid. I know that I've been poked by one of the demons. Some of the slights signified by Coase are self-imposed, instances of Frantz Fanon's internal colonialism. Some are externally imposed. All can be laid bare through the personal made public. There's the story of the academics of color who wrote about the subtle ways in which they find themselves victims of some of Coase's demons' exclusion, expecting less, presuming failure, pigeonholing as brown-on-brown research rather than disinterested research, read, white, and classical empirical. Someone for Way reads the essay once published and files suit for slander. The authors had never heard of the person. This is a very funny story to people of color who have heard it, the laughter of verification and white guilt gone awry. Converse, man, I loved your book or article or essay. I could relate. The same things have happened to me. Something I've heard time and again wherever I travel. Identity minus troubles among Coase's demons. Association guiltless. A new club formed. Somehow, the spick does remain, despite all the good fortune and accolades, not only from within, but from without. While a good academic piece would help me to remember, rich narrative does more for the memory. And the precedent is old. Memoria was the mother of the muses, the most important of the rhetorical offices. Now, rhetorics of writing seem to go no further than invention, arrangement, and style. When delivery is still there, it's the matter of voice. But memory is tied in as well, surely for people of color. It's as if we have accepted Plato's prophecy that literacy would be the downfall of memory, leading only to remembrance. We have to remember Plato because his writing is significant by virtue of its genre, an attempt at representation of dialogue, of storytelling, of the play. Plato's literacy took shape not as logocentric discourse, but as a representation of discourse in action, though folks like Volosinov have shown that all discourse, written as well as spoken, is dialogic. Plato is maybe the coolest of the philosophers because of the resonance of the dialogue, the possibility for humor, the clear presence of all 3 points in the rhetorical triangle, and the often unspecified dimension which is context. I don't mean to be waxing Platonic, really, only to suggest that there's something to Plato's notion of memory as more than recollection and to his leaning on a written discourse that approximates orality as a means toward arriving at memory. The narratives of people of color jog our memories as a collective in a scattered world and within an ideology that praises individualism. And this is all the more apparent for the Latino and Latina, whose language contains the assertion of the interconnectedness among identity, memory, and the personal. There is a common saying among Puerto Ricans and Cubans, "Te doy un cuento de mi historia," literally rendered as, "I'll give you a story about my history, me, history and memory, and a story." 1,000 years before the first Europeans arrived on Puerto Rico, the native peoples of the mainland and the Lesser Antilles migrated to Puerto Rico, where they could live in relative peace, able to fish and live off the fresh vegetation pineapple and varieties of tuber that have no name in English. We don't know the names of the first inhabitants of Puerto Rico. Our history is the history told by the Europeans, who, conferring their values on the land, took the language of the local imperial lords. We only know the names given the first Puerto Ricans by their first colonizers, the first to raid them, the first to enslave them, the ones the Europeans honored by naming the region after them. These first colonizers were the peoples of Carib, and they named the people of that island Arawak, and the culture of the Arawak was called Taino, and their island was named Borican. Then came Columbus, or Colombo, or Colon. I'm glad we've stopped translating people J names, or I'd have to walk around with the name Conqueror Newton. And then Ponce de Leon, then the priests. And when the slaves of Puerto Rico rebelled, slaves from Africa were brought in, and the Boricuas ran inland, away from the fortressed walls of Y Moro, acquiescing to the Spanish, yet surreptitiously trading with Dutch and English, French and Italian pirates who would find other ways to enter the island. This subversion became Jaiberfa. So I understand Angel Rama when he says that it is in the Caribbean that the plural manifestations of the entire universe insert themselves, QTD, in Smorka Life 7th. And my mother's name is Italian. The line is never lost in the Spanish tradition. My father and mother Hernandez, and my mother becoming Maria Socorro Coto de Villanueva. My father was thus Victor Villanueva y Hernandez, and me Victor Villanueva y Coto, until we both were Americanized and I became Jer. My mother's name, Italian. The memory of that first Italian, whether family or slave master, which is how so many of the Tainos got their names, just like the African Americans of the mainland, lost. Centuries after the first Europeans later, I am Puerto Rican, a product of the first migrations of Puerto Ricans to New York in the lat. E-1940s, though my mother arrived through what was euphemistically called indentured servitude, what others called white slavery, as if somehow more barbaric than the slavery of Ricans, and I assimilate. And I don't. But I know how to seem to be Jiberia, and I have the memory provided by story. S told. Memory does hunger. And it fed through the store. I'm trying to figure this out, somehow who I am, from where, playing out the mixes within. It isn't a question for me, whether public or private discourses. I am contradictory consciousness. Discourse should reflect that. I am these uneasy mixes of races that make for no race at all, yet find themselves victim to racism. The discourse should reflect that. I am an American, in every sense a boy from Brooklyn, jazz and rock and roll, and from the Americas, with an ancestry dating back before the Europeans. An academic, a person of color and organically grown traditional intellectual, containing both of Gramsci's intellectual formations, yet not quite his new intellectual. The discourse should reflect that as well. And I am in a wheat fee eld, attempting to pass on a memory as I attempt to gather one. Personal discourse, the narrative, the autobiography, helps in that effort, is a necessary adjunct to the academic. Looking back, we look ahead, and giving ourselves up to the looking back and the looking ahead, knowing the self, and critically, knowing the self in relation to others. Maybe we can be an instrument whereby students can hear the call. A poem by Luis Rodriguez. The calling came to me while I languished in my room, while I whittled away my youth, in jail cells and damp burial fields. It brought me to life, out of captivity, in a street-scarred and tattooed place I called body. Until then, I waited silently, a deafening clamor in my head, but voiceless to all around, hidden from America's eyes, a brown boy without a name. I would sing into a solitary tape recorder, music never to be heard. I would write my thoughts in scrambled English. I would take photos in my mind, plan out new parks, bushy green, concrete free, new places to play and think, waiting, Then it came, the calling. It brought me out of my room. It forced me to escape night captors and street prisons. It called me to war, to be writer, to be scientist and march with the soldiers of change. It called me from the shadows, out of the wreckage of my barrio, from among those who did not exist. I waited all of 16 years for this time. Somehow, unexpected, I was called. Memoria calls and pushes us forward. Memoria is a friend of ours. We must invite her into our classrooms and into our scholarship. Works cited: Adele, Sandra, Double Consciousness, Double Bind, Theoretical Issues in 20th Century Black Literature.